Chapter 1. The Man Who Saluted the Devil Every Morning, Berlin. January 1935. The man walked into the office, straightened his German Navy uniform, and sat down behind the mahogany desk. On the walls, the eagle of the Reich. On the shelves, dossiers containing names that could vanish overnight. Outside the window, a city that obeyed a single man without question. His name was Wilhelm Canaris, and on that day, Adolf Hitler had just appointed the most dangerous man of his life as director of German military intelligence. Canaris controlled the Abwehr, the Wehrmacht secret service, thousands of agents, dozens of countries, an unlimited budget, direct access to the Führer. He knew everything: the invasion plans, the espionage networks, the names of traitors on both sides of every border in Europe. And he would use every single piece of that knowledge to destroy the regime that had just handed him the power. This is not fiction. This is not a legend constructed after the war to protect someone's reputation. This is the true story of how the director of Nazi espionage became the most dangerous enemy Adolf Hitler ever had. Not on a battlefield, not behind enemy lines, but inside his own house, sitting at his own table, wearing his own uniform. How does a man survive for nearly 10 years at the center of Nazi power while dismantling it from within? How does he pass secrets to the enemy while sitting in the same room as the men hunting traitors? And what catastrophic plan did he fight to stop at the cost of everything he had? Chapter 2. The machine that read every whisper in Europe. To understand what Canaris did, you first have to understand where he did it. The Third Reich was not simply a government. It was an architecture of control without precedent in modern history. The Gestapo, the secret police under Heinrich Himmler, monitored every letter, every telephone call, every whispered conversation in every corner of German-occupied Europe. Informants lived in every apartment building, every factory, every social club. Reporting a neighbor was not merely tolerated. It was encouraged. It was rewarded. The SD, the intelligence arm of the SS, operated in parallel with the Abwehr, creating a double surveillance network in which each institution suspected the other, and both suspected everyone. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of this system, was called the man with the iron heart. He did not pursue enemies of the Reich out of ideology alone. He pursued them with the cold pleasure of a man who had found his true purpose. Inside this system, Canaris's Abwehr functioned as the professional military intelligence service, classic espionage, counter-espionage, foreign operations. It had offices in every occupied territory. It ran agents in neutral countries like Portugal, Spain, and Switzerland. It intercepted communications. It planted double agents inside allied networks. Its budget was vast. Its reach was global. Anyone who operated within those walls was, by definition, among the most watched individuals in the entire Reich. Every report was cross-referenced. Every mission was audited. Every failure was investigated with the presumption that it might be something worse than incompetence. And it was precisely inside this machine, inside the very institution designed to detect and destroy traitors, that Wilhelm Canaris chose to build his invisible resistance. Chapter 3. The quiet admiral nobody thought to fear. Wilhelm Franz Canaris was born in 1887 in Applebeck, a small town in the German Rhineland. Son of an industrialist, trained in law, but it was the sea that defined him. He joined the Imperial Navy as a young man. He served in the First World War as a naval intelligence officer, a quiet, technical career, far from the trenches and the headlines. When his cruiser was sunk and he was interned in Chile, he did not stay in prison for long. He escaped. He crossed the Andes on horseback using a false identity. He moved through Argentina under an assumed name. He returned to Germany by submarine. He was small in stature, silver-haired, soft-voiced. He did not gesture when he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He kept a dachshund that he walked every morning near his Berlin home, If the world were entirely normal, colleagues described him as impenetrable. Hitler saw him as a reliable professional, conservative, anti-communist, deeply patriotic. Exactly the kind of man a regime wants controlling its secrets. What no one saw, what no one inside the Reich was able to read in his silent face, was that something had broken in Canaris long before the war began. Historians debate the precise moment. Some point to the Spanish Civil War in 1936 and 1937, where Canaris traveled personally to coordinate German support for Francisco Franco and witnessed firsthand what German forces were capable of doing: the deliberate bombing of Guernica, the mass executions, the systematic terror against civilians. He returned to Berlin quieter, more closed, harder to read. Others point to Kristallnacht in November 1938, when synagogues were burned across Germany, the windows of Jewish shops were smashed, and thousands of Jewish men were dragged to concentration camps in a single coordinated night, and say that it was there that Canaris understood, without any remaining space for doubt, what the regime he served had truly become. What the document shows that by 1939, he was no longer simply serving the Reich. He was operating inside it while working, with surgical care, to destroy its most extreme operations. Chapter 4. The day he chose treason over obedience, the first step was small. Almost invisible, Canaris began falsifying intelligence reports. Not crudely. That would have been detected immediately. But with the precision of an expert, small errors introduced into operational assessments. Slightly incorrect dates, false estimates that understated Allied positions, information that was technically accurate in content, but arrived too late to be operationally useful. He used the bureaucratic density of the Abwehr itself as his shield. A directive lost in paperwork, a report filed incorrectly, an agent reassigned at a critical moment, a translated document that arrived with the wrong conclusion attached. None of it traceable to deliberate sabotage, all of it collectively devastating. But there was something far larger approaching. In August 1939, Hitler was preparing the invasion of Poland. After that would come France. After that, the Low Countries. The map of Europe was about to be rewritten in blood, and Canaris knew every detail: the dates, the axes of advance, the armored divisions, the crossing points, the timetables. He summoned his deputy, Brigadier General Hans Auster, an Abwehr officer who privately shared his opposition to the regime, and made the decision that crossed definitively from passive resistance into active treason. Canaris authorized Auster to warn the governments of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark of the precise dates of the planned German invasion, not vague warnings, not suggestions to remain cautious, specific operational intelligence, dates, force dispositions, axes of advance. The kind of information that, if traced back to its source, meant immediate execution. The director of German military intelligence was handing the Wehrmacht's operational plans to Germany's enemies. From inside the Reich's own intelligence headquarters, using his own authority, under his own signature, the warnings were not fully believed. The Dutch and Belgian governments, fearing to provoke Germany, failed to mobilize in time. The invasions succeeded despite the warnings. The tanks rolled through the Ardennes. Paris fell, and yet Canaris did not stop. If anything, the fall of Western Europe hardened something in him. He had seen what the Reich was becoming. He had watched it from a seat of power, and he had decided that the only possible answer was to keep fighting, quietly, invisibly, from inside. Chapter 5: The secret network hidden inside Hitler's own spy agency through the early war years, as Germany occupied most of Europe, and Hitler stood at the apex of his power. Canaris built what some historians have called a parallel intelligence service, one that served the Reich in appearance, while quietly undermining its most extreme operations in reality. He used Abwehr funds and official credentials to help Jewish families and political prisoners escape Germany, disguised as intelligence assets. This operation, later documented by historians as Operation U7, directly saved at least 14 Jewish individuals who were issued official Abwehr documents describing them as agents in service to the German state. They crossed borders using papers signed personally by the Director of Military Intelligence. 14 may sound like a small number, but each of those documents carried Canaris' signature, and each signature was a gallows waiting for him if it was ever discovered. He passed intelligence to Alan Dulles, the future director of the CIA, then operating as head of OSS operations in Switzerland. Through intermediaries based in Bern, the network functioned through figures like Hans-Bernd Gisevius, an Abwehr officer who served as German vice consul in Zurich, while simultaneously transporting intelligence to the Allies. Canaris knew, Canaris approved. Canaris protected Gisevius from internal investigations that should have exposed him years earlier. He maintained contact with British intelligence through underground channels in Portugal and Spain, neutral countries where Abwehr officers moved openly, never suspecting that their chief was using their operational infrastructure to accomplish the precise opposite of what they believed they were doing. And then came the most extraordinary operation of all. Chapter 6. The Nazi Admiral who walked into the Vatican in 1940 and 1941. Wilhelm Canaris traveled secretly to Rome. He met with Pope Pius XII through the German Bishop Ludwig Koss, a trusted intermediary who moved between the ecclesiastical world and the Vatican's diplomatic networks.
Are secure.
The meetings were conducted in absolute secrecy. A Nazi admiral in the corridors of the Holy See, carrying intelligence on Hitler's intentions to one of the few institutions in Europe that maintained diplomatic contact with every side of the war simultaneously. Canaris was not acting out of religious devotion. He was acting strategically. He believed the Vatican's neutrality and its extraordinary diplomatic networks could serve as a warning system, a relay point, a conduit through which intelligence could flow to governments that might still be positioned to act on it. The Vatican spoke with London, with Washington, with the governments in exile of occupied nations. Within the structure of wartime Europe, it was a communications node without parallel. Canaris was using the infrastructure of the Third Reich to fund his own private resistance operation, with the Pope as his silent intermediary. Inside the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, his deputy Hans Oster continued passing intelligence to the Allies. The Jesuit priest Robert Lieber, personal advisor to Pope Pius XII, served as one of the links in the chain, transporting information between the Vatican hierarchy and British intelligence services without ever committing anything to paper that could be compromised. Inside Switzerland, Hans-Bernd Gisevius maintained his contact with Alan Dulles. Inside Germany, lawyer Hans von Donogny, brother-in-law of the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, used Abwehr credentials to document Nazi crimes and pass the documentation to Allied contacts. Bonhoeffer himself used Abwehr cover to travel abroad, carrying intelligence, while publicly appearing to be a German church official on diplomatic missions. It was a network built not on formal structures, but on personal trust, on human judgment, on men and women who had each decided, in their own way, that there were things that could not be done even in the name of survival. And 4 years, it worked. Chapter 7. The SS man who knew, but couldn't prove it. Walter Schellenberg was 30 years old when he took command of SS Foreign Intelligence. Trained as a lawyer, meticulous, patient, he was not a man of violence. He was a man of archives. He had begun assembling a dossier on Canaris in the early years of the war. Not proof of treason, not yet, but an accumulation of irregularities that no honest reading could explain away. Operations that failed. Agents who turned out to be Allied double agents. Intelligence that was technically accurate in content, but invariably arrived too late to be useful. Reports that contradicted other sources from the same operational theaters. A pattern of failures that, taken individually, were each explainable. Taken together, they were impossible. Schellenberg knew. He simply could not prove it. And Canaris knew that Schellenberg knew. The two men met regularly at intelligence coordination meetings, the silver-haired Admiral and the brilliant young SS lawyer, and exchanged professional courtesies, while each attempted to read what lay beneath the other's words. It was a duel conducted entirely in code, to specialists in deception, sitting at the same table, performing loyalty to the same regime. Canaris played the bureaucratic game with extraordinary skill. When questioned, he had explanations ready, plausible, technically detailed, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 30 years in intelligence work. When challenged, he produced documentation. He cultivated allies in unexpected places. He maintained the appearance of a loyal, if sometimes frustrating, servant of the state. He survived Heydrich. He survived the early Schellenberg investigations. He survived Stalingrad. He survived Kursk. He survived 2 years of catastrophic German defeats that had begun to make every Abwehr failure look like negligence, or something far worse. But there was something Canaris could not control, and it was approaching fast. Chapter 8. The Bomb That Changed Everything. July 20th, 1944. July 20th, 1944. Rastenburg, East Prussia. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg entered the briefing room of the Führer's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, carrying a leather briefcase. Inside the briefcase was a time bomb constructed with British plastic explosive, fitted with an acid detonator that would take approximately 10 minutes to corrode the retaining wire. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the conference table, less than 2 meters from Adolf Hitler. He left the room on a pretext. He walked outside. He waited. The explosion was enormous. The room was destroyed. 4 men died. But Hitler survived, shielded by the massive oak leg of the conference table that deflected the force of the blast at the last possible moment. Within hours, the Gestapo was pulling threads. The arrests began before the smoke had cleared. The interrogations were not subtle. Under torture, names emerged. Under torture, connections were established. The German resistance was not a single unified network. It was a web of overlapping circles, each person knowing only what they needed to know. The cells deliberately isolated to limit the damage of any single capture. But the Gestapo was methodical and patient, and as they pulled the threads, the circles began to intersect. Canaris had not been directly involved in the July 20th plot. He was too cautious for that, too experienced in how exposure worked, too practiced in the art of distance. But he had known some of the conspirators. He had protected some of them, quietly, over the years, and in the diaries he kept, meticulous, coded, hidden behind layers of professional language, there were observations that, in the wrong hands, could construct a devastating portrait of a man who had been working against the Reich for nearly a decade. The diaries were found. Chapter 9. The day the Reich finally caught its greatest traitor, in February 1944, months before the assassination attempt, Canaris had already been removed from command of the Abwehr. Schellenberg had finally achieved what he had been engineering for months: the dissolution of the Abwehr as an independent institution. The service was absorbed into the SD in a bureaucratic coup that had been meticulously planned. Canaris was placed under house arrest and then relocated to command a minor economic warfare unit, a title without power, a desk without purpose, a waiting room. After July 20th, the waiting ended. He was arrested on July 23, 1944, transferred to Prinz Albrechtstrasse, the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, whose basement had become the most feared address in Europe. Then transferred to Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria, where the interrogations continued 4 months. The investigators recovered his diaries from a hidden safe and spent weeks decoding them, cross-referencing names, dates, and meetings. What they found was not ambiguous. It was a record of careful, precise, and damning, of sustained, systematic, deliberate treason spanning nearly a decade. References to meetings with Hans Oster, notes on the invasion plans that had been leaked to Allied governments, observations about contacts with Swiss intermediaries, the fingerprint of 9 years of interior resistance, preserved in Canaris's own careful handwriting. He was brought before an SS tribunal on April 8, 1945. There was no real defense. The sentence had been decided before the proceeding began. On the morning of April 9, 1945, Wilhelm Canaris was led to the gallows at Flossenburg. He was 58 years old. He was hanged with piano wire. Slowly. He died alone, without his uniform, without the insignia of the service he had commanded. Outside the camp walls, the American army was less than a month away. The Third Reich he had spent nearly a decade trying to destroy from within would outlive him by 26 days. Chapter 10. What one man hidden in plain sight actually changed. What did any of it matter? What did it actually accomplish? The question is not simple, and history does not answer it cleanly. The operations Canaris obstructed, the intelligence he buried, the warnings he transmitted, the networks he quietly dismantled, did not stop the war. They did not prevent the Holocaust. They did not save the millions who died in the years between 1939 and 1945. And for those reasons, some historians have judged him harshly. A man who served the regime long enough, who saluted often enough, who bears responsibility for what his institution enabled even as he privately opposed it. But the other accounting is also real. At least 14 Jewish individuals escaped Germany directly through the false WWII documents he personally signed. Hundreds of others were helped indirectly through operations he protected or deliberately ignored. Specific military operations were delayed or degraded because intelligence was distorted at its source. The German resistance, the men and women who organized in basements and whispered in churches, survived longer than it should have, in part because the man who should have been hunting them was quietly looking the other way. Hans Bernd Gisevius, his agent in Zurich, survived the war and testified at the Nuremberg trials, providing intelligence that helped document the crimes of the regime Canaris had served and undermined simultaneously. Alan Dulles, who received intelligence through Canaris's network, described the Admiral years after the war as one of the most valuable Allied sources in Western Europe. The network Canaris built inside the WWII included officers like Hans Oster, lawyers like Hans von Dononyi, and theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, men who used WWII credentials as cover for resistance operations that reached across occupied Europe. Bonhoeffer was executed at Flossenburg on April 9, 1945, 2 days before Canaris. The same camp, the same piano wire, the same morning fog rising over the Bavarian hills. To men, the same gallows, 18 days from liberation. Chapter 11. The diary they found, and the secret it still keeps in the decades after the war. The diaries of Wilhelm Canaris, the very documents that condemned him, were partially recovered and studied by historians in Germany, Britain, and the United States. What they found inside them remains, in parts, not fully understood. The entries were meticulous, coded, built in layers of professional language that concealed, for those who knew how to read them, observations about doubts, about conversations that should never have happened, about men he had met who would later die at the gallows beside him. They were the portrait of a man who had understood, earlier than almost anyone else inside the Reich, exactly where it was all going, and who had chosen to fight it the only way that remained available to him. There is no monument to what he did. There is no clean legacy. There is no triumphant conclusion. There is only a small stone in Flossenburg, in a camp where the wind still carries the heavy silence of everything that happened there. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He never stopped being the director of a Nazi intelligence service. He never publicly denounced anything. He wore the uniform until it was taken from him by force. He compromised constantly, calculating what was possible rather than what was right. He was, in the most precise sense, a man operating inside an impossible situation, choosing the resistance he could execute over the resistance he could only imagine. He was not clean. He was not simple. He cannot be reduced to a single judgment without losing the truth of what he was. He was a man who looked at the most powerful and most murderous system his world had ever produced, from a seat inside its innermost chamber, and decided, quietly, methodically, without announcement, without any possibility of recognition, that he would spend whatever time remained to him making it slightly less lethal than it would otherwise have been. The question his life leaves behind has no comfortable answer. It is the same question that haunts the record of every man and woman who served something monstrous while trying, in the dark and in secret, to make it slightly less so. Was it enough? History does not answer that. It only records that he tried, that he kept trying for 9 years, inside the most dangerous organization in the world, wearing the face of the enemy while carrying the weight of everything he opposed. That in the end they found him, that they killed him 26 days too soon, and that somewhere in that coded diary, in a page that no one has fully deciphered yet, he may have written, in his careful and relentless hand, exactly what he believed it had all been worth.